Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on reimagining your life with COVID-19 as we roll into week 13 or month 4. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Karen Goslin. I've been a clinical social worker for over 30 years and had a private practice here in the city of Toronto since 1998, where I serve children and teens and adults as individuals, couples, and families in my private practice. Today's webinar will be looking at the fact that what we needed in week 1 of the COVID-19 outbreak is very different than what we need now in week 13. I wanted an opportunity to share with you what I've been listening to and hearing in my clinical practice and also noticing in my own life. Our initial reactions to the COVID-19 lockdown were similar to what is qualified as a critical life incident. And that usually means there is an unexpected, rapid change in our lives or threat in our lives of one nature or another. It is common during those times to react with shock and disbelief, fear, panic, frustration, loss of control, and a sense of uncertainty. With a critical life incident, it is common for there to be a 2 to 3 week period of upheaval in our lives in terms of how we're taking care of ourselves, what our routines are, what our moods are like, what our thoughts, emotions, and actions are. And there is a need for ramped up self-care as well as an opportunity to debrief with those we care about and who care about us. The forced new routines that came with the announcement of COVID-19 threw us into an unexpected and immediate new way of doing the things in our life, including how we were working, playing, shopping, spending money and time, all this while under the fear of loss of our health, loss of work, loss of loved ones. Almost everything we knew changed and was beyond our control in the face of significant risk to our health. Common symptoms in the early stages of the COVID-19 lockdown were either in one extreme or the other, for either in having insomnia or oversleeping, overeating, overdrinking, feeling unmotivated, or the opposite, running with real adrenaline, feeling unmotivated and worried. Oftentimes we found ourselves overwatching news, obsessing about things, having mood swings, feeling lethargic or burnt out, feeling depressed and anxious. These symptoms were heightened if at the time of the COVID-19 outbreak, there were pre-existing situations or conditions, such as having previously experienced some level of trauma, having a pre-existing physical illness of one kind or another, having pre-existing amounts of depression or anxiety, or being part of relationships that had a high level of conflict or even violence. Stress was increased during COVID times early on if there were also a number of other factors present. Those living alone had a harder time. Their lack of contact with the outside world, their lack of physical touch, all work towards lowering their resilience. Also, those with precarious employment of one kind or another, either being out of work, being overworked, having frontline work, also put us in places that were extremely challenging for us in the workplace or in our lives financially, and also work towards heightening the symptoms that we were experiencing early on in this health crisis. Also, if we had conflicts in our relationships and then having the lockdown where we were not having the natural breaks from our relationships, also intensified any pre-existing conflicts that were already present. Working parents of young children have had a harder time during COVID, having to juggle the demands of work and childcare. Talked to a lot of clients who were starting to do tag team parenting. So their days were, 2 hours of work, and then they'd switch off with the other parent and then do 2 hours of parenting and then go back to work. or for single parents who were trying to set up their children with the curriculum and the Google Classrooms that the school boards were putting out, and then having to juggle their work meetings and sessions in between, trying to make sure that their children were covered off in what they needed for that day. Teens were also having a difficult time. This has been a particularly challenging demographic group. Teens, obviously, developmentally, their peer groups and their socialization experiences are even more important than the average population. And so under the threat of not being able to do that, a lot of parents were struggling with how to manage the demands of their teens. Teens were sneaking out at night or sneaking friends into the house, and their natural rebelliousness as teenagers was making it stressful on parents figuring out how to manage their teenagers. Those of us who are natural extroverts also had a harder time. Introverts were kind of off the hook, so to speak, and their natural comfort zone of being at home and not having to contend with the outside world, had an easier time of it. And those of us who are extroverted were losing our natural social outlets and the energy that were created for us by having those interactions with the outside world. Early on in the COVID-19 crisis, I provided my clients with a COVID-19 wellness plan. I called it my 4 C's of trying to help people manage through the crisis. The 4 C's included control, creativity, compassion, and cup half full, which stood for gratitude, was the best C-type word I could think of that captured the meaning of that. So initially, I talked to people about finding some sense of control in a very powerless situation. So the idea that I often talk to clients about and became even more important now was the idea that even in very difficult circumstances, where choices are very limited, where can we find some choices so that we can have some sense of control in our lives? We needed to identify what we could control. And early on, this meant making some decisions about how often we would go out. And if we did go out, what kind of precautions would we take? We would think about how to practice physical distancing, wearing gloves. Now it's more typical for people to be wearing masks, but at the beginning of the crisis, to wear a mask or not to wear a mask. But this was some choices we could make that for a lot of us made us feel like at least we could have some control. Thinking about how to adapt our work to make the virtual format successful, planning how we were going to get our groceries. So I thought of this in the early stages of how can I help people feel that at the very least they could cover off their basics and look for a sense of empowerment. So the mindset being, even in tough times, what are the choices we can make? What did COVID not steal from us? But as we're heading into month 4, we realize that a lot of the better choices that we were hoping to make in our lives simply did not come. Cases continued to rise. Number of deaths continued to increase. Schools didn't reopen. Borders didn't reopen. Some workplaces were prohibiting taking time off for employees, while others, it became mandatory for them to work at home. And lost jobs became a reality. Many businesses closed permanently. I think the latest stat from the US is that over the next 5 years, 100,000 businesses will be closing permanently if they haven't already done so. And vacations, things that we look forward to in terms of getting away and having our downtime, were continued to be canceled. The second thing I originally talked to people about was how to be creative. And this is a cornerstone for a lot of what we already knew about how people could build and sustain resilience in their lives when they were facing difficult situations. So I talked to people about trying to reframe the stuckness that they were feeling at home and trying to find creative opportunities. So how we could reframe the stuckness. So looking at things like, well, reorganizing your home, purging what you no longer use, getting rid of stuffed cupboards and reorganizing things, making time for baking and cooking, having the time now to thoughtfully look through recipes and enjoy cooking so it's not a chore. We looked at creative ways for how to spend couple time and family time, whether we were planning creative dates or understanding and planning new creative activities. Sales of games and puzzles and painting kits at Amazon went through the roof. New apps appeared. Zoom was getting used more than ever before. A new app called House Party. I don't know if it was out before or not, but I certainly didn't hear about it. And I think a lot of people didn't hear about it either, but now that was becoming a thing. Netflix extender parties started happening where we could watch movies together and chat. And we were starting to get creative about rituals that we could do every week. So at least we could have a marker or a baseline or benchmarks that we could at least anchor our, lives and weeks with, such as spa Sundays and baking Thursdays and finding new virtual exercises and videos to work out with. But by week 13, these creative ideas were starting to get old. Having time to do things we didn't have time for before were actually in reality things that we never really wanted to do. I remember hearing a story about somebody saying, I never have time to clean out the basement or the garage, and this will be great. This will give me it's a good opportunity for me to get that done. But when we checked in with a lot of people, by month 4, those things weren't getting done. And then people ended up feeling worse for not getting them done. And we're starting to feel more bored and frustrated than others. The third thing I talked to people about was compassion, finding that balance between having a clear structure and routine and doing the best we could for sleeping and eating, school and work routines and exercising. We needed to find ways to talk gently to ourselves with compassion so that even though that balance of structure oftentimes got offset with what didn't get done, we needed to shake it off and cut ourselves some slack. All right, though, so that didn't go as planned. I'm going to do the best I can and get back on track the next day. Maybe I should just pick a couple of things that I really want to do every day. And we talked about different priorities for food. But what we really emphasized here was how important the relationship was with yourself and your self-worth, and your ability to use crisis time, to show yourself some unconditional love. And if you're overworked, look for that balance so that you could pace yourselves. But as time went on, I found that for a lot of the people that I was working with, this initial commitment to better self-care was getting harder, and compassion was getting replaced with shame. Burnout from working from home while parenting became real. Burnout from working long hours became real. Zoom fatigue became a thing that everybody started talking about. The ergonomic pain of stiff neck, stiff back, stiff legs from sitting longer than usual because of inadequate workstations at home. A lot of people were working from home, but a lot of people started working from home for the first time, and their level of physical activity was way down and their bodies were starting to tell them so. Sleep cycles became completely irregular, and the statistics on the amount of junk food eating and drinking alcohol went through the roof. And experiences were inconsistent, adding even further to the confusion, loss of control, and helplessness that people were feeling. They started calling this the COVID coaster, where some days or even some moments within days were great while others were frustrating. Sometimes we felt hopeful, other times we felt depressed. We felt like we were making some gains and then we lost them. We would feel grateful and then we'd feel lost, we'd feel motivated and then we'd feel lazy. So there was no clear trajectory of how we were going to move through COVID. And that inconsistency made us, and made many of us, feel even worse. The last thing I talked to people initially about how to get through COVID was around gratitude. And we talked a lot about how important it was to have an internal gratitude script. Depression and anxiety fueled by catastrophic or shaming thinking snowballed easily, and symptoms were worsened. We thought it would be good to be on the lookout for these negative types of thoughts and be prepared to challenge or replace them. We needed to find some things that the COVID wasn't going to steal from us or our lives. We needed to find some things that were still good in our lives. And those were worth thinking about, acknowledging to ourselves, and making these as big as we could so that we could be giving and having more positive thoughts, more airtime than the negative, and ultimately reach for a better sense of peace. These times were forcing us to slow down, and wasn't that usually a good thing? It's better, of course, if we could have chosen to slow down than be forced into it, but if we're here, then what were we going to do to capitalize on the slow? So we talked about meditating and resting and journaling. Be on the lookout for the good in our lives, in our relationships, in our work, and in our self-care. But as we rolled into week 13, and as the world kept crumbling around us, and our self-care was going down, and the relationships we had were stressed, it became harder and harder to figure out what to be grateful for. On May 31st, the New York Times had an article in that issue that was called How We Broke the World. It talked about 9/11, it talked about climate change, it talked about COVID-19, and it talked about racism after the George Floyd murder. We started to realize that it wasn't about getting through this, that things were not going to go back to the way they were. And that began to feel a whole lot worse. I noticed in my practice around the end of week 7, going into week 8, even before the George Floyd murder, that a second wave of depression was hitting and the mental health symptoms were going up again. We began to realize that it wasn't going to have to be about going back. We had to realize that the world was probably not going to go back. Our lives weren't going to go back to the way they were. That ultimately we had to figure out a way of how to move forward permanently. And this, in my opinion, required a whole new skill set for resilience. So I came up with new pieces to consider that was going to help people. The first thing I thought about was rethinking, not just rethinking from what's called a cognitive behavioral therapy approach, which is really just about trying to make yourself think realistically. The new resilient skill set, in my opinion, was going to be more about changing ultimately how we feel deeper down, that we needed to have a whole new paradigm shift to regulate ourselves and free ourselves, adopt actually new core beliefs, not just new ways of thinking in the here and now. And so this fit more with another type of approach that I use in my practice called dialectical behavioral therapy, which still takes into account the importance of self-care and the importance of thinking realistically, but goes beyond that and helps us internalize concepts of mindfulness. So trying to adopt a meditation practice in our lives so that we can live with more intention, that we can connect with the power of being present. Again, either through a minute meditation. There used to be the Harvard School of Positive Psychology published a paper many years ago about what combats depression. They had 5 things listed off, and one of them was we should meditate for 2 minutes a day. Now it's down to a minute meditation, but can we literally find 60 seconds every day to just stop what we're doing and just go inward? And there's a number of different methods that we can use to meditate that are popular, whether it's about feeling our breath, counting our breaths, doing some type of visualization, having a guided meditation app or video where we can listen to a voice or hear a sound, or we just practice grounding ourselves with the five senses of what's in our immediate environment. But overall, it's about the power of being present and increasing self-awareness. DBT is big on emotional regulation. So in addition to self-care, in addition to thinking realistically, it's about the power of being present. We are much more able to contend with outside struggles if we can find our breath. Meditation is about making the breath familiar. Radical acceptance is also a key concept of DBT. We need to be okay and accept the circumstances. The example of the person who didn't get to their garage, maybe we would benefit more from accepting, I actually don't want to clean out the garage. But in a grander scale, it was about what we can't do. What is no matter what? How can we surrender ourselves to the situations we find ourselves in with COVID-19 without a sense of defeat? If this is what it is, what do I want now in my life? How can I make this work for me? It's that old, song or that old cliche of what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So what can I radically accept about the new world and the new life? And how can I make that my own? What am I going to be able to do in my life, given that there are some things that I will never be able to change about where this world is landing with all of the changes that are going on in the world? We need to find a way to soothe ourselves. Where is that soft place that we can still land? What has COVID-19 not taken from us? And whatever that is, DBT mostly talk about the soothing of the senses, whether it's about candles in our environment, fragrances, essential oils, music. But what are we doing every day to get away from the noise of COVID? We can reduce our exposure to bad news stories and replace it with elements in our lives that are much more soothing. We need to tolerate the distress of the COVID crisis. We need to replace the distress with positive distractors. We need to look for the new opportunities that come our way, or the wake-up calls that we've been thrust into because of this crisis. If we look for the new opportunities, it can sometimes even accelerate changes, not only in our individual lives or in our families or in our relationships, but also in our businesses. Maybe it's time to change our relationship with alcohol. Maybe it's time to take better care of ourselves. So we not only have to think realistically, but we may need to evaluate our values and shift those paradigms and core beliefs. We need to find a practice where we can get out of the noise and have breaks from the noise in our head, where we can radically accept those things that we can't change, where we can still find soft places to land, and whatever we need to create in our environments to help with that. And we have to know that we can tolerate the distress. And finally, what DBT people talk about is the sense of mastery. We know that if every day we can do at least one thing that we know we are good at, it reminds us of our goodness. This builds significant resilience. So then whatever negative piece comes our way during the day, we're not coming from an overdrafted position. We've got money in our bank. We've got emotional banking for resilience, because we just feel better about ourselves if we regularly are doing things that we know we have good competence for. I've taken a number of different DBT tools and combined them into a 4-part sequence that can be helpful for people to practice every day. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, it can be very helpful for us to take, if not more than 60 seconds, as I said, to just get out of the noise in our head, put us back in our bodies. And then we want to insert some compassion. It's a fill in the blank sentence that goes something like this. What was so very hard for me today was when. And so we have that kind, gentle voice that we talk to ourselves with. CBT people say, we should be kind to ourselves. DBT people said, we should talk to ourselves as if a good parent talks to a sick child, with patience, with kindness, with gentleness, with sweetness. So we need to acknowledge something that may have been hard for us that day without any judgment. The third part is acknowledging, this is connected to the mastery, acknowledging something that we did well today. It's about learned optimism. It's about noticing that even amongst the storm, there are some positive things happening. We need to do this every day, especially on days that are very hard. A big part of resilience is that we can notice the positive, even if it's really small or tiny, even when there are really bad days or bad moments. So the fill in the blank for this goes something like, what went well today was when I blanked, and that tells me I am blank. And the second blank in that sentence is filled with an adjective. We often carry a very strong internal critic or judge whose purpose is to protect our vulnerability, but oftentimes we will overprotect ourselves. And so this forces us to think of positive personality traits or adjectives that we could use to acknowledge our strengths. And it starts to upset that balance. So what's getting more airtime is noticing what has gone well and how we actually contributed to that going well, as a way of, shifting the mindset so that we're looking at our goodness. The last part of this is a fill in the blank that goes something like this. So what I need today is. When Oprah meditates, or at least this is how she used to describe it, at the end of her meditation, she would always say, what do I need? And this is a question that is best answered after we're meditating, because we are out of the noise in our head. The noise in our head is connected to our ego. It's connected to our wounded self. And that's where our internal critic or our judge comes in. And it gets noisy. It gets blurred. It changes how we're thinking about ourselves. If we take a minute to get out of that noise, what we can access is our wise gut or our wise mind. They say that the neurons connected to our stomach are only second in complexity to our brain. So this whole cliche statement of, trusting my gut, it turns out there's something real to that. And this is easiest to listen to or hear when we've just done even just a short meditation. So we say, what do we need? Or we ask ourselves, what do we need? And the first thing that comes up is usually what our mind is trying to tell us, what our wise gut is trying to tell us. And I was talking to somebody earlier today about this, and they were like, well, what I need is rest, but I don't have time for that. And they went over it a couple of times. And she was back into the noise in her head. And so we talked about that for a few minutes. And we're like, well, if what you need is rest, let's talk about how the rest of your day is going to roll out. And how can you still find some component of rest? Because your body is trying to tell you something. And the noise in our head will talk us out of it, find an excuse, find a reason that this can't be done. And then we're negating ourselves, and we're going to get farther away from what we really want and need. And that is only going to increase negative symptoms. I also thought about the importance of resetting, whether it's about pacing ourselves differently, because it looks like this isn't going to go away anytime soon. We're likely not to see any major changes until we have a vaccine, which most experts are saying are a long ways off. And so we're not running a sprint, we're running a marathon. So the pacing is important, and we have to balance and find that sweet spot where pushing ourselves just hard enough, but giving ourselves breaks exists. And that's the sweet spot that we're aiming to find. We need to find and take mental health days off. A lot of organizations did start giving employees more days off, even after the long weekend in May. And so technically people had, 2 long weekends in a row, because healthy organizations started realizing that they had to build in sustainability for their employees. And that if this was going to be a long haul and people were going to need to continue to work from home, and that the demands were going to continue to be higher in some regards, that we had to learn a whole different way of pacing and where we needed to emphasize the breaks. We needed to build off-screen breaks. We needed to find ways of stepping away from the screen and going for walks. And people needed to improve their ergonomic setups at home with new chairs, new keyboards, headphones, new screen stands, so that their bodies weren't getting physically stressed if working from home was going to continue to be the reality. And we needed to start thinking about what our vacations were going to look like, because if international travel was still going to be impossible, then we needed to figure out, okay, we can't just continue to work nonstop, that we did have to create breaks, and maybe we needed to reinvent our original ideas of what our vacations were going to look like, whether we stayed at home and found a way to take breaks at home, or whether we found local travel, or as I understand, some cottages and rental properties were beginning to reopen. The other thing we knew that was important was to find a goal that we could pursue. Resilience in part can come from feeling like our life has a purpose. And maybe that purpose had to change. Maybe our goals had to change, but it couldn't be about just, erasing the goals. We have to replace them. We have to find something else in our life that's going to give us meaning. And if we were naturally an extrovert, how could we move it, if just not a few notches to the left, so that we could find some energy within the aloneness without feeling isolated, and how we could ultimately be more comfortable with the stillness. The third thing I started to think about was how people had to reconnect. Helping others is one of the key ways we begin to feel resilient. We've seen a lot in the media early on in COVID, and it has continued to today. And we see this even before COVID, how it was important for us to be able to reach out and help others. And somehow that strengthened us too. So we saw the beginnings of sewing masks, and I saw people on the news using 3D printers to create the PPE equipment that was, needed, and there was deficient amounts of. People found online parties, COVID-19 diaries, they called it, whether these were Facebook groups or writing groups and journaling groups and video chats with workplaces, and how we could reorient our family time. People started having Zoom parties, online versions of all types of games and card games and Scrabble and all kinds of things that in some cases were already there. And in a lot of other cases, there was a huge expansion. And sometimes people started connecting with people they hadn't seen for a long time. And that was starting to nourish people. I even heard of one organization where the managers were sending out written postcards to their team members. And, something so simple, and how exciting it was for people to actually get a handwritten card in the mail. And that just made people feel less alone and less isolated, even though they were physically isolating. Ultimately, what we're talking about is reimagining and trying to understand what our new normal could look like and what we wanted it to look like. We needed to start identifying what was worth keeping. Was it about being more still and slowing down? Was it about optimizing our family time together? Was it ultimately about looking for new opportunities with business or education? Like I said a few minutes ago, maybe the different use of 3D printers, healthcare apps are being considered, new technology for use with passports, new digital marketing ideas, new businesses such as more dining at home experiences. And I've heard a lot of people about taking the opportunity now to write those books that they have never had time for. Rediscovering that maybe working from home really wasn't that bad. A lot of large, more conservative organizations have become more flexible about team members working from home. And some people started telling me that they thought these changes that were starting to happen in their organizations would have probably otherwise been 10 years down the road. But these changes were happening now. They were forced realities that in some ways were forcing organizations to think differently about this. And ultimately, it's not only about new flexibility, and more flexibility, it's about new values. And the people that started feeling a bit better were finding ways of discovering new ways of living, whether it was about their eating habits, about finding joy in the simplicity of life, feeling good about the less urgent timelines that they were on, finding more peace. And as I said earlier, maybe discovering that working from home could have its benefits. Humans are interesting. We tend to get very comfortable with the way things are, even when it's not working for us in one way or another. And I know from the people that I work with, the biggest changes come when there's a crisis and a problem. That's when the chips are down. That's when our defenses are down. And in some ways, we're kind of thrust, beyond our control of what we can do and not do. And that is where new ideas come. That is where new ways of doing things come. And oftentimes, even if we don't realize it at the time, we may not really understand how we're growing. We can oftentimes look back and go, in some ways, it was good that happened because I never would have discovered this otherwise. Resilience is about what we do with adversity, how we grow around rocks and still find water. And sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, the water we find is even more nourishing than if it had been plentiful in the first place. I want to close off this webinar with a poem I came across some weeks ago. And I found this video and I thought it was very fitting.
And the people stayed home and read books and listened and rested and exercised, made art and played games and learnt new ways of being and were still and listened more deeply. Some meditated, some prayed, some danced, some met their shadows. And the people began to think differently and the people healed. And in the absence of people living in ignorance, dangerous, mindless and heartless ways, the earth began to heal. And when the danger passed and the people joined together again, they grieved their losses and made new choices and dreamed new images and created new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed.
So thank you for listening today. I hope that you have heard something that has normalized the experiences that you've been having during this most difficult time, and appreciate that maybe some of the coping strategies you had at the beginning need some shifting, and there's some new ideas and new ways of thinking and taking care of yourselves and your family and your workplaces and your body so that you can transition into whatever this new normal takes us into. because it appears that we're not going back. We're going somewhere new. For any audience members who are watching the recording of this webinar, please reach out to me and I will offer you a 50% discount off the assessment rate in my office. I'm not only practicing in Toronto, and I have reopened in-person therapy sessions as an option as of May 19th, and virtual sessions continue. I was doing virtual sessions long before COVID for many reasons, or several reasons. Clients can't make it to my office. So I'm very comfortable with those formats. So regardless of where you're watching this from, you can reach out and take advantage of that offer to attend your assessment. Take care, stay healthy, and I wish all of you the very best.